Vietnam veterans in American jail. Let's talk about it. And how often do we even think about or discuss Vietnam veterans who are incarcerated in the United States? You know, you got to think about it. The Vietnam War ended in around roughly 1975. I was born in 77. My dad just missed the Vietnam War when it came to being drafted. My dad and my uncle, they were right at that age range to where if the war would have lasted another, 4 or 5 years, they definitely would have went to war and got drafted. But it ended in 75. Like I said, I was born in 77. But what about Vietnam veterans who are doing time in the American prison system? There are a lot of them. There are a lot of Vietnam veterans who came back home after the Vietnam War. They didn't just come home to being ridiculed and mocked. Now think about this for a second as a citizen, no matter where you stand politically. The veterans, the men and women, this was the poor boys from around our entire country. It didn't matter if it was the inner city, in the ghetto, or the projects, or the farmlands, or the poor hills and mountain towns throughout this nation. All the poor kids, poor boys in America, whether they were black, white, Spanish, or whatever, were drafted and sent to fight in a war that went nowhere in Vietnam. Now, you might be saying, I never would have went to war. Sure, some people dodged the war and they went to prison. Probably the most popular person who dodged the draft and refused to say anything and do anything about it was Muhammad Ali. And we know that he dodged the draft and he didn't go fight because of his beliefs. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think anybody, should stand up and fight for their country. But at the end of the day, I respect it because that was his beliefs and that's what he stood for. And he didn't back down. He was willing to stand and fight for that. And we know that Muhammad Ali wasn't no coward. The dude was a great fighter, probably the best one ever. And he just wasn't going to go to war in Vietnam but for something that he didn't believe in or that he, maybe religiously was against. Now we know Muslims in Islam, they will go to war and they will fight. We see it all over the world today. But specifically, I'm talking about Vietnam and the Vietnam veterans. And I'm going to tell a story about while I was incarcerated and the 2 Vietnam veterans that I did time with while I was in prison. And these are the 2 that stick out and that I remember the most. They were in the same prison, in the same place that I was incarcerated at, and they also worked together in the kitchen. What's interesting also is that you get 2 different sides. One was from the small, rural towns in Louisiana, white guy, and the other one was from more of the smaller towns also in Louisiana, plus inner city. Halfway he grew up here, halfway he grew up there, and he was black. But both of them, when they were teenagers, 18, 19 years old, were drafted to the Vietnam War, and both of them went to Vietnam, fought in Vietnam, and witnessed and experienced combat, and they were both in prison. Now, I did my prison time in the 1990s is when I initially went into prison. So you got to think in the 1990s, let's say the Vietnam War ended in 1975-ish. I went to prison around 95-ish. So that's like 20 years after the Vietnam War. So that puts some of these guys who were fighting in Vietnam in their early 20s at this time that I'm in prison now. These guys are in their, 40s, late 30s, 40s. And depending on how old they were when they served. And I think both of these guys were, like I said, at the time I was in my early 20s. These guys were in their 40s, early 40s probably, mid 40s. And like I said, one was black, one was white. But there's something that I decided to look up as I was debating on this topic to talk about. And in 1998, according to the Bureau of Justice, and in American prisons, whether this was jail or prison, there were veterans of Vietnam. 56,000 Vietnam veterans were incarcerated in 1998 in the United States of America. And 18,500 veterans of the Persian Gulf War were incarcerated. So you had almost, 50, 60, 70 something thousand veterans who were imprisoned in the 1990s who served time in either Vietnam or the Persian Gulf War. Now, these two guys I did time with, it's one thing I've learned in life, and it's not just because I'm scared to ask them, but it's a respect issue. I've learned when it comes to veterans or men and women who served in foreign wars, it's better not to ask them questions about combat and ask them questions about that. A lot of those people like to take that stuff close to their chest and they don't like to talk about it. So if they don't bring it up or they don't leave an opening door to bring it up, I won't mention it. Even though I'm interested in it, I won't ask them about it. Now, these two people specifically who I don't remember, one guy's name's crossing my mind, but the other one, I believe and remember his name was Billy. And I remember how they used to interact. Like I said, this is in Louisiana prison where the political structure of race isn't as serious as it is in a lot of state and federal prisons around the country. It's more open and to intermingling between whites and blacks. And one of the guys was black and one was white. They both served in Vietnam. They both laugh and joke together. They occasionally, you would see them in between breaks in the kitchen, sitting down, smoking a cigarette and drinking coffee together. I can only imagine some of the conversations. I didn't sit down and talk with them every time, but I remember thinking to myself, and I'm in my 20s, but I was perceptive. And I remember thinking to myself, man, those two guys got some stories to tell. And over time, over the years that I worked in the kitchen, there was moments where I was able to talk with both of these guys where they would open up about the Vietnam War. And if I recall right, both of these guys were in prison for substance abuse or DWI. Driving while intoxicated, getting caught with drugs, and just, a lot of self-medication. They had a lot of issues in their mind and mental health issues that arose from fighting in war and witnessing things that they witnessed to in war. Both of them told me that they lost friends in the Vietnam War. Both of them told me they held men in their arms while they were dying, and the men ultimately died while they were holding them. So these men came home and they were never quite able to assimilate back into society. Now think about it, if you in your early 20s and you just fought a war and you coming back home in America and you got a bunch of punks protesting you in your face. That's right, if you protest soldiers who come back from war, you a punk. I said it, you're a punk and a chump, and that's it. If you're gonna go protest Capitol Hill, go protest the White House, and think about them chumps you keep voting for in office. But you don't protest the men and women who put on a uniform and serve and fight overseas. Sometimes in Vietnam, they didn't have a choice, they were drafted. And they come back home and get spit on. If I see somebody spitting on a soldier, then that might be one of the few times that I possibly can go back to jail for getting into a fight. That's stupid stuff. You're punk. You don't do that stuff like that. You got to respect the men and women who put on a uniform. You might not like what the justice system does, but if you're a criminal, you're a criminal. Right now we talking, and you a gangster, you're a gangster. You thugging, you thugging. You know the rules. If you do the crime, you're gonna get caught. You might have to do the time. That's just the way it is. But the people who protest, a bunch of little punks especially from college universities, protesting and spitting on veterans. That's a punk move. You know what I mean? There ain't no way around it. But I'm gonna tell you the story of Billy specifically. He told me a story one day, and this was the most deep he ever gotten to me. When we was having coffee, I don't smoke. He was smoking his cigarettes. It was in between, like breakfast and lunch, and we were sitting out back, and we were talking while we were working in the kitchen. Out behind the kitchen area, you got the big freezer area outside that you bring the food in and out. And picture you got the gates with the barbed wire, you got the guard walking around, and you can hear the inmates on the yard, weights clanking and everything. And I'm just sitting there talking to this guy, and I don't know how, but somehow or another, we wind up in Vietnam. I'm just letting him talk. And he's talking to me, and he says, yep, as he's smoking a cigarette. And he's talking real slow. He's not fast. I tend to talk fast, but this guy's talking slow. Yep. And I'm just listening. And he said, I remember me and my unit were in this little village in Vietnam. And he said, we were all young boys. We'd been there for a little while. We had been in a couple battles. There had been a couple firefights. They had witnessed some things. They had been there for a little while now. They would probably deep into their tour. And he said he remembers that they were all sitting down. It was in this village. It was uneventful. There was nothing going on at the moment. And he remembers him specifically watching this boy, a young Vietnamese boy, ride around on his bicycle. And he rode around the troops and he kept riding back and forth. He said the kid just, and he said he don't know why, but he watched the kid ride his bicycle in circles. He would go down the village and come back toward the soldiers. And he kept doing this. And he said it happened for a little while. And the kid just kept riding in circles. And he said he don't know why, but he watched him the entire time. And he's like, man, you know, he said he didn't think anything specific, but he was just watching this boy, this young Vietnamese boy ride around. And he said he was thinking about, you know, home and thinking about, you know, his family back home. And he said at some point or another, everything just went from slow and methodical and steady with no issues to all of a sudden the little boy stopped, pulled a hand grenade out, pulled the pin and threw it where he was standing with other soldiers from his unit. Everybody screamed, grenade, everything's on. He said it's happening quick, but everything's paused in slow motion. He saw, because you got to think he's watching the boy the whole time. So he said he saw the boy stop his bike, reach down into his pockets, into his jacket pocket, pull out a grenade. He said he saw him pull a pin and throw the grenade at him and the rest of his unit soldiers who were standing there. And he said that when everybody yells, he yells grenade, everybody starts jumping, all of a sudden everything's slowing and boom! He said everything's just silent. You could hear the buzzing, your ears almost like zzz. He says he looks over and one of his friends in the unit, his body is in pieces all around him. Billy says he looks at the boy, he looks at his friend, he said everything's happening so quick. He pulled his M16, aimed it at the boy and fired. Pow! He shot the boy. Pow! The boy falls off the bike. This all happens quick. He gets up, there's blood everywhere. His friend's dead. Everybody, all the other soldiers and the people in the village who took cover, everybody's starting to come out now and everybody's standing there and he's looking and he said he's got his friend, part of his friend's body in pieces all over his body. And he said he's just looking and he's in shock. And then he looks at the little boy and he realizes, I just shot a kid. I just killed a kid. And he's looking at me and there's this empty stare on his face. It's like that 1,000-yard stare. He's talking to me, but I don't think he's talking to me. He's just reliving this moment in his mind. And I just happened to be there. And he happened to be speaking it out loudly, verbally. And I'm just listening. And I'm like, my heart is compassionate for him, his friend, the little boy who was placed as a little boy in war, who did what he thought was right to defend his people. And the guy who I'm talking to who had to kill a boy. And after it's over, there's silence. And he's smoking a cigarette, sipping his coffee. I'm sipping my coffee. I'm just, no words are spoken. I'm not saying nothing to him. And he looks, that 1,000-yard stare just looks. And I remember him uttering, I'll never forget that boy's face. It stays with me every day. When I wake up and when I sleep, even right now, I still see that little boy's face. He said, I shot him. He was just a boy. And I was thinking, dang. And so we sat a few more minutes before conversation shifted into something else. I didn't ask him to elaborate. I didn't ask him to get into deep detail. I just thought that here is this veteran of war inside a prison for constantly being drunk. He couldn't stop drinking. He was always DUI. He had like 5, maybe been half a dozen or more DUIs, and always getting caught drinking in public. He was always drunk. Couldn't stop drinking, getting in trouble from drinking. And now I see why. And my heart hurt for him because I didn't go through that. I went through gangster stuff fighting on the street, but I wasn't in a foreign war. And the other guy, I can imagine the conversations that they had. And like I said, one was a black guy and one was a white guy. And they spoke to each other all the time. And they had this respect for one another. And they had this understanding for one another because both of them served. Though they were both different races. One was white, one was black. They both grew up poor. Neither one of them had influential families. And they were both taken as teenagers and put into a man's war. This is the devastating things that happen inside the justice system in our country. There are men and women right now who are inside the American prison system who were affected by the wars they fought so that we can have our freedom. And I wasn't in war. I just committed crime. I deserve to go to prison for the things that I did. And some of these men, for the things that they did, they also deserve to go to prison, because just because you fought in war don't mean that you can get away with crime. And some of the veterans come back home and do some heinous things. And I can imagine, like I said, I've talked to other veterans in prison. I know one specifically. He was one it's hard to have sympathy for, but I believe he had some victims that he killed while he was overseas. Women. I think he was a predator. But these two particular guys were different. And my heart went out to them. And I'll never forget either one of them. I can see both of their faces in my head right now. And remember talking about them, about the Vietnam War. And keep in mind, there are a lot of people now in America who are still coming back from wars, who have some struggles. War and prison are real. And some of the men never even came back home to get to an American prison. They were held as POWs and died inside concentration camps or, prison war camps under probably harsh conditions of torture and who knows what else. But that's my story of meeting two Vietnam veterans in the same prison who worked in the same kitchen, and I had a lot to learn from these guys because I paid attention. So if you know somebody who's in prison today, tell them don't be stupid, sitting around watching music videos, doing nothing, acting like an idiot, planning their next crime, thinking about the strip club they're going to go to. Tell them open the Bible, learn something about history, learn something about themselves, soul search. I looked in the mirror and had to soul search to become a different man that I am today and quit making excuses. Check out my new channel, Southern Crime and Incarceration, as I try to get this thing going. I'm learning this social media thing, and give me a like and a subscribe. Support a small channel. Thanks.